Hey guys, on this channel, we provide, or we try to provide, a safe space for members of what I call the true crime community to discuss true crime cases, right? Without having to be battered or badgered, might be a better word, or bullied in the comment threads. Regardless of which case we're discussing on this channel or over on BitChute or in Patreon or on Facebook or on WordPress, we do our best to keep the comment threads clean of the abusive and sometimes even threatening comments and the drama that seems so prevalent on the other YouTube channels. I just have to say, you guys, YouTube is different than the rest. BitChute doesn't allow any of this crap that's going on YouTube. BitChute doesn't allow it. And neither does Facebook. And neither does Patreon. When there's a jerk in the Patreon group, guess what? I go to the list and I boot them. It's great. And if there are jerks sitting there listening in, whatever. But when they start acting jerky toward the other members, they get shown the door. And it's great. It's wonderful. And we email back and forth and we have great discussions. That's how the true crime community used to be before the case of Christopher Watts. I've said this before 100 times or more, actually, I'm sure. Probably close to 1,000 times by now, I'd say, in the last couple years. All opinions are welcome in this true crime community. We simply ask that you actually discuss the cases. Because, as you've learned by now, when the attackers show up here to post their nasty comments, they're booted right off the bat. And I do my best to go through the comments and to try to clear off anything that's just over the top, not okay. On this channel, I'll say it again, we are true crimers. We're not here to try to build a channel by fighting with other channel creators. We're not here to see if we can monetize it and get super chat and all that garbage. That's not what we're doing here. And that isn't how the true crime community works. On this channel, we are survivor advocates. Most of us on this channel are educated and trained and experienced advocates. So our discussions here are far different than the discussions you'll see on the other channels on YouTube. We don't deal with this superficial BS that's going on all around us. We dig in to the cases that we're discussing. We examine. We research. If we're discussing Munchausen by proxy, we know what Munchausen by proxy is. We know what the warning signs are. We know that it's typically the mother of preschool-age children who has Munchausen by proxy. We know that children who are being medically abused routinely suffer from allergies and asthma and stomach problems. And we know that children who suffer from having a Munchausen mom are at risk of being smothered. We're not just throwing a random term around. We're discussing why we may have the opinion that Munchausen by proxy was one of the core issues in the case of Christopher Watts. We discuss. We debate. We know how to discuss. We know how to debate. And yes, often we will disagree with one another. And that's okay because we're adults. We know how to disagree without having to act like we're, I don't know, a 2-year-old having a temper tantrum or something is what I guess is the best way to describe what we see going on, right? All around us, it's just plain silly the way people are acting. And the accusations, oh my goodness. Are any of you tired of hearing people say, "You're just jealous"? Are you kidding? Christopher Watts' wife has lost her life. She was miserable leading up to her death. She was sad. She was angry. She didn't feel well. She was broke. I think there were a lot of secrets that were about to surface. I think she was desperate. And then the same people who say, "Oh, you're just jealous of Christopher Watts' wife," they also like to say, "You're in love with Christopher Watts." Catch a flippin' clue. Nobody on this channel is in love with Christopher Watts. That's ridiculous, and it just shows how shallow and cheap the person making that comment is. We're not followers here either. Many of us are old enough to remember the days when it was basically allowed for women and children to be abused in their own homes. And many of us were agents for change. If you're younger, as in like half my age, this might bore you a little bit. But I encourage you to hear what I have to say. Back in the day, we spoke out at community meetings, promoting the need for something at the time that none of us really knew exactly what it would look like, but we knew that we needed it. We advocated for the creation of family court systems. Depending on your age, you may not be aware that not that long ago, there were no family court systems. Cases involving custody or child protection or domestic violence were all just part of the bigger picture in the circuit court. And in many cases, details of abuse were not something that were considered. Did you know that back in the day, that abuse, family violence, abuse was not one of the best interest factors in custody cases? Did you know that? Think about that. Domestic violence, abuse was not one of the best interest factors that could be considered, right? When determining custody for children? Back in the day, we spoke out in support of funding so that women's shelters could be opened. And in some cases, so that women's shelters could be built. Back in the day, not every city had shelters. In fact, very few had shelters. And as a society, we recognize the need for shelters for women and their children who were being abused. And we worked hard to make sure that that need was met. Back in the day, we spoke out regarding the need for good quality child care providers. We recognize the need for licensing so that when working moms needed to leave their kids with a babysitter, that they could have some sort of reassurance that the child care provider had actually been checked out. Back in the day, we spoke out and we stood for a woman's right to be able to have a baby without losing her job while she was on maternity leave. It was not that unusual back in the day for a woman to lose her job due to a pregnancy or the birth of her baby, or at the very least to lose her position and to be demoted when she came back from maternity leave. And here's another one for you. Back in the day, we spoke out and we stood firm to even be able to have maternity leave. And I'm not talking about paid maternity leave. We counted our lucky stars if we were able to have a 6-week unpaid maternity leave. That was progress back then. I kid you not. That was a great company that you worked for if you had a 6-week unpaid maternity leave without having to worry that your job would be gone in the meantime. Back in the day, we spoke out and we stood firm for our right to breastfeed our babies in public. And before that, we spoke out and we stood firm when we were told by society, including, of course, our babies' pediatricians, that bottle feeding was best. I don't know if you guys are aware of that because, nowadays everyone knows breastfeeding is better, right? Well, back, I would say in the early 80s, late 70s, there was a little bit of a movement. It was really in the late 70s, I think, more. By the time the early 80s rolled around, it was already moving. Society did not believe in breastfeeding. The top pediatricians were advising young moms to bottle feed. The big time formula at the time was Similac. And then they came out with Similac plus iron. And I think they were $1 a can for the premix, if I remember correctly. When you had a baby, the nurses were promoting bottle feeding in the hospitals. Promoting it. If you're going to breastfeed, it's very important that your nurses are encouraging you to keep trying, right? Get that baby to get used to breastfeeding, right? The first day or two, it's just so important. If it's your first baby and you don't know what you're doing, or if the baby doesn't take to it easily, you give that baby a bottle, and your chances for figuring out the whole breastfeeding thing, or for your baby to figure out the whole breastfeeding thing, it's going to be a lot tougher because obviously the baby's not hungry. Well, back in the day, the nurses were pretty much putting those bottles in the baby's mouths, even if you made it very clear that you're a breastfeeding mom. The norm was to give babies Similac plus iron. We seriously had to stand up to our pediatricians to say, no, I'm a breastfeeding mom. And I'll tell you, it's a good thing when your kids, obviously gain weight properly and we're at the top of the charts and everything, because the moms whose kids weren't were told to go on the bottle. Not the moms, but the babies. And I'm not talking babies who were sickly or babies who were super tiny or anything. I'm talking babies who were average or even a little bit above average. If they weren't topping those charts, the growth charts, then the pediatricians were adamant that you needed to do what they called the supplemental feeding, which translation means screw up your chances for a successful breastfeeding experience. Because again, if the baby's getting the bottle, then it makes breastfeeding all the more difficult to achieve. Have you ever thought about this before? Have you ever considered the fact that the generation before yours had to be kind of extra tough in order to breastfeed our own babies? Huh? Oh, it gets better. Because after a while, we decided we wanted to be able to breastfeed our babies in public. And that was an entirely new experience. And you know what? The public didn't take kindly to those of us who decided that when the baby's hungry, the baby needs to eat, right? Come on. We did the thing with the blanket over the baby's face and everything. You do like a little tent and you feed your baby. I mean, we weren't flashing our boobs like I see people do actually nowadays. We were modest. We weren't pushy about it. But society as a whole didn't want to see it. They didn't want to know. They thought, evidently, that that was offensive. Think about that. It wasn't that long ago that it was offensive to see a mother feeding her baby. Back in the day, even before the breastfeeding thing, we spoke out for equality in the workforce. We spoke out for equal opportunity in the workforce and for equal pay. You know, nowadays, pretty much you can figure you're going to get equal pay for equal effort and equal qualifications, of course. But back in the day, just because you were female, you could and you often would be paid less than your coworkers who were male who were doing the same exact job that you were doing. Back in the day, employers would say that their male employees had families to take care of. That's how they would justify paying men more than women. Back in the day, we banded together and we fought for tougher laws against drunk driving. Did you know that back in the day, it was routine? Maybe not every time, but it certainly was not uncommon for a drunk driver to be allowed to have somebody come and pick him up from the traffic stop and give him a ride home. Back in the day, we banded together and demanded for laws to require that the courts and law enforcement actually took action and worked toward the prosecution of rapists. Did you know back in the day, for all intents and purposes, there was really no such thing as marital rape? If you were married and your husband raped you, well, the common response would be, how could your husband have raped you? Because you're married. There's no such thing as being raped by your own husband. Back in the day, we banded together and demanded that, specific to spouse and child abuse, the courts and law enforcement listened and cared. They weren't required to, if you were abused, and if your abuser was actually prosecuted and convicted, then you were one of the lucky few. Back in the day, if a child was abused, or if a wife was abused, too often law enforcement would close the case before the case was ever even opened. They would use the term family matter, and yes, they would drive away. Back in the day, when a child or a woman was beaten or battered, and then when they would tell the emergency room doctors and nurses that they fell down the stairs or that they were just clumsy and ran into the wall, the medical professionals would often, whether they believed the patient's stories or not, they would often accept the excuses as if they were true without ever reporting the incidents to law enforcement. Did you know that back in the day, when an abusive husband and father fought for custody of the children, that the courts were not required at all to listen to any evidence of abuse? In fact, I think in some cases, they even refused to. So I just want to say we've come a long way, baby. And if you're half my age, you may not know what "we've come a long way, baby" even means. And that's okay. Because back in the day, when we were speaking out and standing firm and getting louder and louder with our repeated pleas for safety, for security, for protection, and for opportunities, and for hope for ourselves, yes, of course, but more importantly, for our children, so that the world that our children would inherit would be a world that was safer for women and children, for our daughters and for our sons, for our grandchildren, so that children can truly be safe in their own homes. In 1994, Nicole Brown Simpson was brutally murdered. There was a very slow police chase in June of 1994. And then there was a trial, and it was a lengthy, convoluted, confusing, sometimes very disturbing, sometimes a little bit humorous. Not that there was anything at all humorous about the case itself, but there were a couple of witnesses that were kind of funny. society collectively gained awareness in June of 1994 of the serious issue of domestic violence. Society learned that sometimes our heroes really aren't. Society learned that domestic violence knows no socioeconomic boundaries. Some of you younger subs may not know, but that was the case back in 1994. That actually added the last name Kardashian to our collective vocabulary. The name Kardashian back in 1994 was not symbolic of fashion or fitness. The name Kardashian became well known because the Kardashian women's father, Mr. Kardashian, was a true friend of the defendant who stood by the defendant's side throughout the ordeal, and who stood by his side also when the verdict was read and the defendant heard the words, "Not guilty." Mr. Kardashian was a fair man, a caring man, a highly intelligent man, and he was very hardworking. He did his best to help his friend as he defended himself during the trial, right? He was an advocate for his good friend, O.J. Simpson, because he believed in truth and justice. And he believed in providing the best possible defense that the quote-unquote dream team of lawyers could provide. Society was torn apart, really, after hearing the verdict. Some abusers actually at the time laughed. Some abusers cheered even. You know, there was a thing back in the day called high five. Some abusers were high-fiving when their hero, O.J. Simpson, was found not guilty of murdering his ex-wife. And some abusers actually celebrated because the defendant was and would then remain their hero. And their hero was finally set free. But there were many others who did not laugh or cheer or celebrate the verdict. Many people actually cried, right along, I'm sure, with the family members and close friends of both Nicole Brown Simpson and her friend Ron Goldman, who was also murdered at the same time at Nicole's house. We didn't argue with anybody who disagreed with our opinion on the case. We discussed the case and we debated the case. We discussed our opinions about the case. We debated the merits of the case, and we even criticized and critiqued the skill sets of both the prosecution and the defense. And we criticized and critiqued their performance at trial, too, of course. There's something else that we were openly criticizing and critiquing. And this is going to sound really strange, but I kid you not. Society was having a field day during the O.J. Simpson trial with criticizing and critiquing the hairstyles of the prosecutor, who happened to be female. And at one point during the trial, she changed her look. And it didn't go over well. And pretty soon, it seemed that every move she made didn't go over well with society, including with women. She was put through hell. I should mention, I think that was either the first or one of the first. Actually, it wasn't the first, because I know the Broderick trial, I think, was on television. Maybe not. I think they may have just had parts of the Broderick trial that were like on the news or on one of the, like 60 Minutes or something like that. I don't know, I'm just guessing. But I think, if my memory serves me correctly, I do think that the O.J. Simpson trial may have been the first trial ever to be televised live. It wasn't just the prosecutor's hairstyle that we were criticizing and critiquing. We also paid close attention to the testimony of the witnesses and of the defendant himself. How did that go? I think it was Johnny Cochran, one of the defense lawyers. When O.J. was on the stand, he took the famous leather glove and told O.J. to put it on his hand. And the leather glove was too small for O.J.'s hand. And it may have been in the closing arguments, I think, that Johnny Cochran said, "If it don't fit, you must acquit." Well, the glove didn't fit. And like I said already, O.J. was set free. There's more to that story. If you're interested in learning more about it, it's a very interesting case. There was a detective who was accused of planting that glove at O.J.'s house. And I think later the detective, in an interview, pretty much made it sound like he felt like he was thrown under the bus by the prosecution. So again, if that case interests you at all, that's a good one to dig into and to study. It's a very good case to examine. It's very interesting. There was one witness who was a hoot. I'm not sure if I have his name right. I think his first name was Cato, and his last name was something like Cato, but it wasn't Cato. I think it was like Cato Kate. Cato was his first name. Cato Caitlin or Ko, I don't know. It was Cato something. And he was really actually kind of funny. He was kind of a goofball. And he evidently was living in O.J. Simpson's guest house. And he had a couple of answers while he was on the stand. I don't know. It isn't fair for me to say he was a goofball, but I think he kind of came across a little bit when he testified as if he was maybe a little bit of a goofball. But looking back at his testimony, I think actually he was just like totally blunt and honest. Remember it was on television, right? So I don't know, maybe he was nervous or not, I don't know, or maybe he was like hamming it up a little bit for the cameras or trying to act like Mr. Cool, I don't know, but that was kind of interesting. It's strange. His name, I can't imagine it was Kato Caitlin. Whatever, his first name was Kato. I think it was Kato, but I'm not sure of that either. If you Google O.J. Simpson and then do Kato, you'll find it, I'm sure. With that trial, with that case, with that true crime case back in 1994, when society discussed that case, regardless of the opinions of whoever was involved with the discussion, people were not attacked or ridiculed or bullied for their opinion on the case. There was no right or wrong or just one opinion that was allowed. We discussed the case and we learned from each other. And those who we learned the most from and those who we taught the most to were the people in the discussions who we disagreed with the most. My dad insisted, and he debated, and he discussed at length with me why he held the opinion that O.J. Simpson deserved to be found not guilty, that O.J. Simpson deserved to be set free. Well, I insisted and debated and discussed at length with my dad why, in my opinion, O.J. belonged behind bars for the rest of his life. Throw him in prison and throw away the key was pretty much my attitude at the time. The murder of Nicole Brown Simpson was a tragedy, of course. There were no winners. There was no healing or closure or moving on for many years to come for those who knew her and who loved her dearly, for her family members and for her close friends. But there was something positive that did come from the trial, at least regardless of the verdict. Because that trial was the catalyst for change in our country, for real changes to be made, and for real awareness and for a better understanding of the serious issue of domestic violence. Our discussions and our debates could not and would never be able to bring Nicole back or to take any of us back in time. So the day she frantically called the police, begging for help, while her ex-husband was yelling at the top of his lungs, and heard by the police dispatcher, by the way, when Nicole was on the phone. He was yelling at her from the other side of her door that he was pounding on in his attempt to break it down. In that phone call, Nicole Brown Simpson predicted that her ex-husband would one day take her life. My generation did not speak out and stand firm to promote awareness on the serious issue of domestic violence because there was an interesting case in the headlines, and any of us wanted to win any debate or discussion by thinking we could prove that somebody with an opposing view on the case was wrong, or evil, or psycho, or stupid, or jealous, or in love with the defendant, for Pete's sake. We did not ridicule or shame any person who believed whatever opinion they had on the case. We spoke out and we stood firm. And we held steady in our opinions, in our discussions and debates on the case. But we did so with respect for the person we were speaking with. We did so with respect for ourselves. We were agents of change. The case of O.J. Simpson was an opportunity for our society to learn what it needed to learn in order to understand the issue of domestic violence, in order to begin to learn how to help bring an end to the violence. Now let's fast forward to the case of Christopher Watts. The case of Christopher Watts, just like the case of O.J. Simpson, has no winners. It was a tragedy, of course, and one which will obviously take many years to even begin to understand fully. Just like the murder of Nicole Brown Simpson was so difficult to comprehend until actually many years later, how it could be that love could turn to murder. Or not. Remember, he was found not guilty. Or that tragedies such as Nicole's case could ever occur in the safety zone of her own home in one of the finest neighborhoods in our country. There are many of us who are true crimers in the true crime community who are of the opinion that it is reasonable to believe that Christopher Watts may have actually been telling the truth when he said that he did not murder his daughters Bella and Cece Watts. It doesn't make any of us evil or stupid or what the attackers like to call us, jealous of his wife. I'll say it again, jealous of what? She's no longer alive. And leading up to her death, she was downright miserable and broke. She wasn't feeling well. She was in tears. And her marriage was over. And in my opinion, she knew damn well that marriage was over months before the night or the early morning hours of that tragedy. I don't think she was in a good place at all, with her hopes and her dreams, no doubt shattered, when perhaps she had a sudden realization that everything she thought she had any power or control over was already gone. There were people, many people, men, yes, of course, and many women too, who believed wholeheartedly that O.J. Simpson did not murder his ex-wife. And I don't remember anybody ever accusing those who believed that O.J. was innocent of being jealous of Nicole. The mere suggestion of such a ludicrous claim is preposterous. I'm heading back to Patreon now after spending just a couple of days here back on YouTube. I gotta tell you, I have been off YouTube for, what has it been, like 4 months? Maybe even longer. And I'm loving it. I've only been back here a couple, 3 days. Oh my goodness, you guys. It's a friggin' cesspool. It's nothing but drama. I don't see any intelligent conversations going on between channels at all. And some of the videos that are being uploaded, there's nothing about the case on it. They'll put the case name in the title, of course, because they know that's how they get their clicks. They'll throw a couple of the photos up that make it look like it's a case discussion video, but it isn't. It's all about who they're mad at this week. That is so sad for me to see. Because the true crime community isn't like that at all. So I strongly advise you, if you're into true crime cases, if you like discussing true crime cases, definitely join us on BitChute, join us on Patreon, join us on Facebook, join us on WordPress. Join any groups on BitChute and on Patreon. and on Facebook and WordPress, because there's a whole lot of really good discussions going on about this case and about many other cases. And the discussions are interesting. People treat each other with respect. And people can actually learn from their own research, of course, but also from each other. Whether or not they agree with each other, it doesn't matter at all. And like I said before, if you agree with someone, if you're just all kind of lining up and singing Kumbaya, because you're all going to follow whatever narrative you're told to follow, what will you ever learn? But if you're able to engage in a discussion with somebody who you disagree with, that's your opportunity to learn. And it's your opportunity also to teach. Before I head back to Patreon, I want to say this. I want to encourage you to be an agent for change. Be a change agent who helps promote awareness and understanding. If you don't know how to discuss and how to debate and to differ in opinion with respect for the person you're speaking with and for yourself, if you don't know how to do that, then please try harder. Try to learn how to take part in effective, interesting discussions. Not only with those you may agree with, of course, but especially with those you don't. The case of Christopher Watts, in my opinion, presents multiple topics of interest for discussion. Was there an open CPS case? And if so, why? Why on earth was the student loan written off in the bankruptcy? Where was that other quitclaim deed? And why was it signed? Was there a history of mental illness? Why wasn't there a will? Why weren't the children named as the sole beneficiaries or in addition to the spouse on any and all life insurance policies? Why were we told that Christopher Watts' wife was a nurse? Why were we told that she was highly successful? Why were we told that she had multiple serious diseases when it appears to many of us, true crimers, that the information we've been told is suspect at best? Why did a close family friend say that all she had to do was see a commercial for a new illness and she would claim to have that illness too? Why were we told that the bankruptcy was due to medical bills? And why were they so broke already, just 16 months after the bankruptcy? So broke that Christopher Watts' wife, who handled the finances, did not make the house payment for 3 months straight. And then he had to take $10,000 out of his 401k in order to save the house. Why is it that the house hasn't been sold yet? Why is it that Christopher Watts said one thing at first and then he pled guilty? He pleaded guilty to murdering his wife and his children. But that isn't at all what he said happened at first. Why? And then a few months after pleading guilty, he changed up the story a little bit again, didn't he? Why? Have the agencies involved in this case, have they taken a closer look to see maybe where they can do better in the future? What can be learned from this case? What are the warning signs of Munchausen by proxy? Why did Christopher Watts' father say the word bipolar? Why did Christopher Watts' mother say she was afraid of her daughter-in-law? What dose exactly is, quote, lots of Tylenol? Did the girl's doctor instruct their mother to give them Benadryl and Tylenol every night at 6:30 before they were put to bed? And why the hell were they put to bed every night at 6:30? You know, unlike the O.J. case, the case of Christopher Watts never went to trial. Christopher Watts' best buddy wasn't a high-powered lawyer, and his last name wasn't Kardashian. Christopher Watts wasn't anybody's hero like O.J. was to so many. But wait, because Christopher Watts actually was a hero to his daughter, Bella, before the tragedy occurred, which robbed poor little Bella of her life. Do you remember that one video where Bella is singing that her daddy is her hero? Isn't that sad? Oh my goodness, that's so sad. Poor little Bella deserved to be safe in her own home, just as every child deserves to be safe in their own home. And if we can discuss this case, the case of Christopher Watts, with an open mind, with respect for each other, and for each other's opinions too, and with a willingness to learn, to gain awareness, then in my opinion, while the case itself is tragic, and while healing and closure and moving on may take years for family members and close friends, society as a whole can benefit from our discussions. If we can learn from this case in the same way that society as a whole learned so much back in 1994, and for many years after 1994 too, from the O.J. Simpson case, the murder of Nicole Brown Simpson. Be a change agent for good. Understand that some may be focused solely on discussing Christopher Watts' flaws or on discussing his wife's flaws or the impact their flaws had on their children, while others may prefer to pretend all of the flaws away and to never seek awareness or understanding of what happened the moment that poor little Bella and Cece were murdered. But if we can try to take part in case discussions, then maybe someday the answers to our questions will become clear. We cannot bring any of the victims back. We cannot roll back the clock and say to both Christopher Watts and to his wife to get away from each other immediately. We can't say to Christopher Watts and to his wife, for Pete's sake, stop spending money you don't have. We can't tell them to try harder. We can't tell them to get counseling. We can't tell them to seek medical care. We can't tell them to stop living beyond their means, to sell that house for Pete's sake. We can't tell them to be very careful about how much money is being spent on 5 or 6 product-based multi-level marketing companies. We can't tell them to cut the crap about one person taking care of the finances when obviously the finances weren't being taken care of. We can't tell them to stop with that whole, oh, I own my own business routine when it's an MLM. Did you hear that one interview where the friend said, oh yeah, she wrote off, I think she said something like she wrote off all of their expenses or something. She wanted the receipt from the restaurant when Christopher Watts took his girlfriend out to dinner, right? Although she didn't know supposedly at the time that he took his girlfriend out to dinner. Well, according to the friend, Christopher Watts' wife wanted the receipt because she wrote off everything. That isn't how it works, you guys. Christopher Watts taking his side chick out to dinner is not tax deductible. But if you've ever been involved with an MLM, that's one of the little lessons that they try to teach you is, oh, don't worry. Yeah, the convention, oh yeah, it might cost, $600 or $800. It might cost $1,200, whatever. But it's all tax deductible. Don't worry, spend. You gotta look like you're making it. You gotta fake it till you make it. Spend. You have to invest in yourself. You have to believe in yourself. Don't hang out with people who don't believe in your dream. If we could turn back the clock, we could tell Christopher Watts and his wife to run, to put on their Nikes and run from any type of opportunity that evidently had them spending more money than Christopher Watts' wife ever brought in. And before you call me jealous, I guess is the go-to insult, if you think that Christopher Watts' wife was making money, then answer me this. Why didn't she make the house payment for 3 months straight, just 16 months after walking away from $70,000 worth of debt? Why were they due in court for unpaid HOA dues for a little over $1,500? Why did they go to North Carolina? That's a really good question. For 6 weeks? Well, you would think then that there would have been a surplus in the checking account, right? Because she didn't pay for daycare during that time. But there wasn't. And the house payment was due. And it wasn't paid. And they were due in court. And some insist that they were due in court for 2 separate court hearings, one of them being for the HOA dues, and the other being for, quote, an ongoing family matter. If we could turn back the clock, we could say, tell the truth. Be honest. Turn toward each other and tell the truth. We could say, Christopher Watts, stand up for yourself. Why the hell are you doing all of the laundry, the cooking, taking care of the girls, giving them their baths, cleaning the house, and working full time, while the girls are both in daycare full time, while your wife sits on her ass at home? Stand up. And if you are fearful of telling your wife that you're leaving her, then it's your responsibility to get the help you need, to reach out for the help that you need. We could turn back the clock and say to Christopher Watts' wife, give me your phone, because your phone is going bye-bye. We could see some of those posts on Facebook and say, like I mentioned earlier, what dose is lots of Tylenol? We could see all of the claims that both children are sick again. Both children are sick again. Both children are sick again. If we could turn back the clock, we could say to her, something's wrong. And you either get the help you need, or I'll make sure that the kids are getting the help that they need. We could turn back the clock and say to her, what the hell do you think you're doing giving those kids Benadryl and Tylenol every night? We could turn back the clock and say, what do you mean you have lupus? Really? Really? And for those who she said that she was cured of lupus, if we could turn back the clock, we could say, yeah, sure you are. Righto, Skippy. Allergies? Anaphylactic shock? Deathly allergic? How on earth could it be that it seems, looking at all those videos and all of those Facebook posts, that nobody on her planet ever confronted her? Why? We could turn back the clock and we could say to her, find your authentic self. Stop being superficial. Stop pretending. Be a change agent. Learn how to discuss and to debate. And learn how to appreciate discussing and debating true crime cases. so that society can be helped, and so that society can gain awareness in order to do a better job in the future for other couples facing the same issues, really, that Christopher Watts and his wife were dealing with, except I really shouldn't say dealing with, because you know what? I don't think they were dealing with their issues at all. I do believe that Christopher Watts was afraid of his wife. I also think Christopher Watts was exhausted. He was doing everything. Even when he got out of work, he drove home, changed his clothes, got in the car, drove back to the daycare center. If she wasn't able to drive with the children in the car, was there no one on her planet to help? Wasn't there another parent at the school? Anything, anyone to try to take some of that weight off of Christopher Watts' shoulders? Some of that burden? He had to do it all. Well, it seems being afraid of his taskmaster. If we could turn back the clock, I'll tell you the day that I would turn it back to would be the day that Christopher Watts stood inside of the slider, inside of the house, just on the other side of the slider, watching his wife with that laugh while she sprayed poor little Bella right in the face. Bella ran toward her hero, and her hero was told not to save her, and he didn't. Think about this. What if Christopher Watts was a battered male? What if the case of Christopher Watts is the landmark case for the battered male syndrome, just like the case of O.J. Simpson was the landmark case for domestic violence? Ask yourself this: what can society learn from this case to be better prepared to help other battered men in the future? What do you think about my idea of changing the names of women's shelters and we start calling them family shelters? Now consider this. What if little Bella was being medically abused? What if there was an open CPS case? What if Christopher Watts' wife did suffer from, I think it was bipolar, was the word that Christopher Watts' father said? What if she did have Munchausen by proxy? What if she did make up diseases and illnesses and allergies? This should go without saying, but I'll say it anyway. Asking these questions doesn't mean that anybody is bashing anybody. It means that we are a society. A true crime case discussion community that chooses to dig in and to ask questions and to really take a look at these cases honestly and to openly discuss what we see. Do we recognize signs or symptoms of abuse? Do we see any warning flags? If so, what are they? Do we see posts on Facebook that are alarming? And are we even more alarmed that there were people actually clicking like? I am here to tell you, even though I'm heading back to Patreon, the case of Christopher Watts will no doubt continue for many decades to come. And I'm here to tell you that, in my opinion, I do think it is reasonable to believe that Christopher Watts was telling the truth when he said that he did not murder his daughters, Bella and Cece Watts. It doesn't mean that I hate anybody. It doesn't mean that I'm jealous, for Pete's sake. It doesn't mean that I'm in love with the defendant or with the convicted now. At all. You guys do realize he's like half my age, right? So when you say that, if you're one of the attackers, when you say that over and over again, it's like, ew. It's ludicrous. And when you want to go on and on trying to, do your body shaming crap and whatever, it doesn't work. Here we are, over 2 years after this case hit the headline news. You're still trying to attack, and I'm still going, oh, brother, there they go again. Learn to discuss. Learn to debate. Be an agent for change. Bella and Cece deserve for the truth to be known. And they deserve for society to care enough that we do dig into this case and say, what the hell happened to those poor babies? And why?